Hello, Elisa. Happy Ramadan. Ramadan Mubarak if you're celebrating. Hope all is well. Joke of the day. I didn't want to believe my dad was stealing from his job as a road worker. But when I got home, all the signs were there. Okay, so for today, pop. Yeah, so we'll look at art. This is not the most, well, I don't know. Seems kind of weird trying to teach you art this way. But look at some pop art. Um, I've included, some images and, me talking a little bit over um, at the end of this video. I've also included two videos which are actually pretty good. One is from PBS that talks about Andy Warhol, gives you a good background on him, and one is actually from the Tate in London with Alan Cumming. So how bad can that be, right? He lost to Alan Cumming. So they're short, but they're actually pretty good and giving you a sense of an overview of a lot of this stuff. And of course, a lot of this is just subjective, so that's why it's kind of weird to kind of teach it this way. But we'll give it a shot. It's a good break as we kind of finish looking at the 1960s, the politics, domestic politics of the 1960s, and now we're going to move towards Vietnam, which will start next week. Reminder: your paper is due on Tuesday in the National Endowment for the Arts. So yeah, start that because I don't think, probably guessing, knowing you as well as I know you, start it. But yeah. Again, you have questions, feel free to email me. But yeah, so hope all is well. Stay safe, stay smart, and talk to you guys later. All right, so today we're going to do a really quick overview of pop art, looking at some key images from American pop art and from the late 1950s into the 1960s. Um, so pop art really, nothing, comes out of nowhere, right? And so building on the idea of abstract expressionism, Jackson Pollock, William de Kooning, in the 1950s, you get works like this by Jasper Johns, Three Flags, or this map, also by Jasper Johns. And so these are works that are not as large as abstract expressionist paintings, but they're flat, right? And so if you remember with abstract expressionism, they talked about the flatness of the canvas, brush strokes and that type of. So in particular with map, you see the action painting, you see that, but a map is inherently a flat object. A flag is a flat object. He also painted series of targets, again, flat objects. So again, flattening the canvas, which is something abstract expressionists did, but now you're also starting to play with objects that are familiar, they're popular, so something that normally wouldn't warrant being painted, a map, a target, a flag, that type of thing. So these are typical everyday objects that people might have laying around their homes, well, maybe not a target, but elevating them to an art form. Um, then you get someone like Robert Rauschenberg and the idea of a combine. So mixing painting with actual materials. So this is his famous bed. And so that is an actual comforter, kind of folded over on the top. There is some fabric up there as a quote unquote pillow, and then lots of paint. Um, and this combine also then moved towards collage. And here you see again popular images of the 1960s. These would be images found in magazines that people, would be readily available to them in the public domain, and then taking them and elevating them again to an art form. And so now we're starting to get towards. So first we had everyday objects. Now we have images taken right out of magazines and newspapers and things like that. And that brings us to someone like an Andy Warhol. And Andy Warhol, again, taking everyday objects and elevating them, taking objects out of popular culture, famously with tomato soup cans, right? This idea that, and he paints tons of tomato soup cans. The idea was when he was eventually asked, hey, why are you painting so many soup cans? He's like, well, every morning I have a can of soup. And so, again, it's an everyday object, that type of stuff. Elevating the everyday, elevating the mundane, that type of stuff. And he did this in sculpture. And so here you see Brillo boxes and cornflakes and boxes for tomato juice and whatnot, but also played with the idea of celebrity. And we saw this already with one of our previous Do Now works when we look at Jackie Kennedy. And so here's Marilyn Monroe, right? So we talk about how Jackie Kennedy was, the height of popular culture. Well, Marilyn Monroe is not far behind. And the idea of Marilyn Monroe, though seen here as kind of like almost like a Byzantine icon, right, surrounded by gold, it almost becomes like an icon or religious devotional um, piece, which says a lot about how Americans view celebrity and that type of stuff. Um, Coming out of Warhol, there's also Roy Lichtenstein, who is from New Jersey. And Lichtenstein takes comic book images and, again, using a projection system, projects them onto a screen, onto a canvas rather, and then paints them onto the canvas. And again, these are everyday objects. These are cartoon images. Um, and so starting with Mickey Mouse and Popeye and images like that, and then eventually creating his own, influenced by war comics um, or influenced by romance comics. And you get these the one frame where you don't get the narrative kind of either before or after what's going on, which connects to the do now activity you have today. Klaus Oldenburg, who is a sculptor, working in the same vein, so sculpting everyday objects. So here is a toilet, but his play on it is this idea he messes with the idea of what is a sculpture, right? So first off, your subject matter is kind of odd, right? He's doing a toilet, but he did a series of soft sculptures. Um, so this idea of almost like an inflatable toilet that's kind of, and all of his soft sculptures are in this state of kind of deflating. So the idea of, you can almost imagine trying to sit on that toilet, what's going to happen, that type of, and he did this with items of food, pay phones, that type of stuff. He's much more famous though for his monumental sculptures, in which he takes, again, everyday objects, blows them up to a huge scale, and then just randomly kind of like places them, in parks and in odd locations. Uh, and so this is Shuttlecock, and this is was on display inside the Guggenheim, right? So if you've been inside the Guggenheim, right, this is that central kind of space. Those are the gallery ramps, um, that type of thing that you see there. And so pop art, though, kind of continues on. And then you get someone, like a Keith Haring in the early 1980s, who is from Pittsburgh, like Andy Warhol, is influenced by Andy Warhol, knew Andy Warhol, because they're working at the same time. And Haring, who was studying at the School of Visual Arts in New York, so at the one end, he's actually studying fine art. But at the other end, he kind of gets plugged in and pulled into this street art. He meets up with Basquiat, who is kind of a student protege of Warhol, who isn't really doing pop art, but is doing very abstract kind of paintings. So Haring kind of connects with him. He connects with graffiti artists of the day, and he just kind of begins playing with line and that type of stuff. So this image is actually kind of interesting. This is actually something that's quite common in New York. So you'd have these posters in the New York subway, and so on the left you see a poster for a movie, and then what happened would be is that when the posters were done and they didn't have a new poster put up, they would just paint black over these old posters. Um, and so what he did is he'd go into the subway and then he would take chalk and he would paint, or rather he would draw on top of that black paint. And I love this. On this image, you actually see the graffiti on the other one, where it says Haring, stop it enough already, and someone pointing at him, which is probably something Haring did himself. And Haring then also kind of took that idea of public art and also then did art around causes. So he was very active in New York City during the AIDS epidemic, and so you get his ACT UP posters that you see there at the bottom. Crack is Whack is still on display on the FDR Drive. I know that because that is the landmark for me to get off the FDR Drive and head towards Citi Field to go see the Mets. It's still there. It's protected. It's actually like it's got landmark status in New York. Big fence around it, everything. But these monumental public works, again, kind of, it's pop art. It's art for the masses and that type of stuff. And like Warhol, he made his art available. So Warhol famously would paint anyone's portrait. And so if you gave him, I think it was like $25,000, you pay $25,000 to Andy Warhol, he'll paint your portrait. Keith Haring in the 1980s opens up a store where he sells his own merchandise. He actually decorates the interior of the store. He sells his work on T-shirts, mugs, calendars, and they're still ubiquitous. You can still go out and buy Keith Haring mugs, T-shirts, posters, and whatnot. That image on the very special Christmas CD is still used by that every year they put out another CD. They still use Keith Haring images. He wanted his art to be for the masses. He wanted people to have access to his stuff. Again, that's something he took from Keith Haring. Or rather, he took from Andy Warhol, and the two of them were similar in terms of that way, making art for people. And just like it was controversial for Warhol to do it, it was also controversial for Haring to do it. So they were very similar in that way. But that's kind of what pop art is, right? Again, making art accessible to people, elevating the everyday, street art, that type of thing. And we see this, in artists of today, most famously someone like a Jeff Koons, who is still alive, still making art. This is his Michael Jackson and Bubbles from 1988, when Michael Jackson was the mega global superstar, no one on the planet more famous than Michael Jackson, and creating this image which he called a banality, this idea of taking a gold Michael Jackson with flowers all around him, and again giving him that icon type status that Andy Warhol did with Marilyn Monroe. Koons, though, is kind of famous for these types of images. Again, these, it's a balloon animal. It's our everyday object. You blow it up to a massive scale, getting that idea from Oldenburg. And Koons, like Warhol, famously says, there's no meaning behind this stuff. This is just a balloon dog. It is just a rabbit. There's nothing more kind of to it. Just like Warhol said with his art, it's just a bunch of soup cans. It's just Coke bottles. It's just Marilyn Monroe. And so this idea of the stuff that like Koons is doing is now kind of called neo-pop, right? Coming after the Warhols and the Lichtensteins and the Oldenburgs. But we still see this idea evident today. And even with a Shepard Fairey or a Damien Hirst, other artists today that are still kind of making stuff.